Welcome back to A Better World. This is your host, Mitchell J. Rabin, and I'm very glad you're joining us again today. Today we're going to have a very interesting show. We have invited back a gentleman who has been with us several times, all the way from India to New York City, and now he's in New Mexico. So we are speaking from New York to New Mexico, through Zoom, as you can see. And this time we're going to be speaking about Carl Calleman's latest book, which is Quantum Science of Psychedelics. I love the subtext. The Pineal Gland, Multidimensional Reality, and Mayan Cosmology. Now, Carl is a renowned Mayan scholar. He's been around the world lecturing, giving workshops, teaching people about the nature of Mayan cosmology. And there are not that many people who really are so familiar as Carl is with this subject. And it's a wonderful story of his having been on vacation in Mexico while having been a cancer researcher at the World Health Organization some decades at this point back, and found himself utterly, completely fascinated and taken by Mayan architecture, and started to learn more and more about the society and culture itself. That led over the course of years, since he has been a scientist, of a much deeper and broader understanding of the nature of Mayan cosmology, the calendar, and he has written extensively on this subject. And it's on those subjects that we have had Carl speaking over the course of years. So it's really a great pleasure and honor to have Carl back with us today on A Better World to talk about this most recent work of his. So, Carl, good friend, good to see you, and welcome back to A Better World.
Oh, thank you, Mitch. It's great to see you. You know, we had a couple of interviews, but they haven't been with video, and I haven't really seen you for, I think it might be 10 years or something like that.
It might be.
But yeah, it's great. Yeah.
We've all grown a little older, Carl.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah.
You know, but
Yeah.
in fact, since we're going back historically for a moment, and we'll go further into Mayan history, we first met in 2004. Correct.
Yeah.
And we had lunch together. We just crossed paths. We had lunch together at what is called Oneness University, where you were the advisor at large on Mayan calendar and cosmology. And I was there in my capacity, like now, to interview the teacher of the place and many of his associates and students. And then we did an interview then in a little Indian thatch-roofed hut. It's different now, I see, on the Venus transit. That was our first video interview. And then when you came to New York, we did a workshop, and we sat in my studio here at Stuyvesant Town and did another one. And since it's been by radio, it's true enough.
Yeah. Around the world together.
Exactly. So talking about around the world, we're going to go multidimensionally now around the world.
Exactly.
To taking a look at some of this awesome research you have done that informs this book, Quantum Science and Psychedelics. And so each of these two, of course, are remarkable studies in themselves, and you're bringing them together under one umbrella, so to speak, makes it all the more compelling, which is why I wanted to have you on to share what you came to see about what they have as an interface, and to take a look at what is the relevance of these discoveries you've made about the Mayan calendar, about Mayan cosmology, and the mind-expanding, mind-altering, modifying use of psychedelics, together relevance to today and our lives in our rather tumulted world that's trying to find its own feet and identity again. So why don't you start to walk us through what you feel is the relevance, first of all, of Mayan cosmology, and then into the calendar, and then into psychedelics.
Oh, yes, yes, thank you. Yeah, I mean, first of all, at some point I came to the insight that the Maya calendar system really is a system of time that describes quantum shifts. And that's a big thing, really, because nobody has really talked about that before. And it looks, you know, first, people might think that's completely different, the Mayan calendar and quantum theory. What's the relationship there?
Sure.
But I would say that, yes, the ancient Maya did develop the embryo, at least, of a kind of macrocosmic quantum theory. And the first inroad to grasping that, I think, is simply to look at their pyramids. And you know, to the Maya, I think their pyramids were like poor man's Bibles or something like that. It's was something they could, you know, the very architecture of the pyramids had information that everybody in those days were probably aware of. So fundamentally, for instance, if you go to Chichen Itza, or if you go to Palenque, to Tikal, or a couple of other major Mayan sites, you will find that in the center of these sites, there is a pyramid built in 9 stories. They're not smooth, the pyramids of the Maya.
Like the Egyptians, for instance.
Like the Egyptians, for instance, which are smooth. No, they are terraced forms. And that really is a strong indication to begin with, that they looked upon the evolution of the universe as being quantized or quantum phenomena. Because one of the characteristics of quantum theory, and maybe the characteristics of quantum theory, is that on the level of the microcosmos and atomic structure and so forth, the electrons can move between quantum states. They do quantum leaps, but there's nothing in between. You can't stay in between. It's like taking a step in a staircase and trying to stop in between the staircase. You can't put down the feet there. You have to.
It's almost like space to space, hard as that is to even conceive of. But
yeah.
And it's also, if I may, and please correct if that's not a right idea, of particle to energy, energy to particle, which is an ever-shifting quantum phenomenon.
It is an ever-shifting quantum phenomena. But what I'd rather emphasize is that a quantum state, according to the Schrödinger equation, is really a kind of a geometry that organizes energy. And so if you move up on, climb the different states in an atom, you're actually going through different quantum states, different geometries organizing energies. So that's kind of the starting points. The pyramids are built like 9 quantum states on top of each other. And then, of course, we're transported to another area of the universe. We're looking at the universe, the macrocosmos of the universe. It's a different area, but the same principles do apply. That throughout the evolution of the universe, you go through a number of quantum leaps. And each leap is characterized by a certain geometry. And in this case, at the top level of the highest quantum states, it's about geometries that organize the human mind, that organizes the human perception and human creativity and so forth. And so from this perspective, we can understand the entire evolution of humanity, including its mental and technological, economical, etc. evolution, based on the idea that people in different time periods have been downloading a different geometry of the mind. And that's really the inroad to understanding one of the first things in the book title, the multi-dimensional reality. So in this model of the universe that the Maya left behind, you have several different dimensions. In other words, every quantum state that you may download gives you a certain perception of reality. And if you shift between these, it will be like you're shifting between dimensions. And reality in this whole picture will be multi-dimensional. And so then there is a whole story of over time, these different quantum states have been activated at certain points in time, and we can track how this has been reflected in human history and so forth.
Is that when you take the, say, the 9 waves described in the Mayan calendar, and let's just say overlay that on human history, and you will see that there are these certain points of what Terence McKenna referred to as moments of novelty, where there was something occurring that is outside normal phenomena, and one that you would say, my God, that could be a war, that could be the Renaissance, that could be some kind of, well, we might call it a quantum breakthrough in understanding. It could be Galileo. It could be a moment when the mind shifts. And according to what I'm understanding, to some extent, I should say, is that it shifts the geometry of understanding. That part I'm not so, I can say it, but I'm not so clear about how that happens.
Yeah, yeah. Well,
is that a fair representation of what you're saying?
It's definitely a fair recollection.
Okay.
It's definitely exactly that.
Okay.
I just want to add, to begin with, that the evidence is sort of much stronger. I mean, all these things you mentioned, yes, you can, you find them as being placed in certain moments of time and novelty generating moments in time. But it's also that you can sort of track patterns. It's not just sort of anything happening, kind of. It's like you can track, say, the mathematics, step, 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 step.
Oh.
And with every peak in a wave, you will get a more advanced expression of the mathematics. And so, you go from the very first use of numerals and multiplication tables 5,100 years ago, basically, when the 6th wave began. And then when you come to the last of these peaks, then you have the explosion of modern mathematics that took place in the early 17th century with Descartes, with the logarithm, the probability theory and stuff like that. You can see that's what we call the scientific revolution in Europe. And the point I'm making is that here you can track a particular phenomena and many other particular phenomena, but in this case we're talking about mathematics. And another very important thing is the link between this with the geometry. The downloading of the geometry was really what gave rise to the first pyramids and cities and all that kind of, the structured mind came into existence. And when people download that, then their creativity is altered, and it becomes different.
So I want to back up a little bit just so I understand, and I hope the audience will benefit from this. But because you put a lot of dense information on the table here, Carl, which I would
Yeah.
expect from you and appreciate. uh, and at the
Yeah.
same time, I'm seeking to deconstruct it a little bit,
Right.
not to knock down the pyramid, but just to understand some of its inner workings, which would be, so you talk about downloading a geometry. So
Yeah.
let's say at the beginning of either human history or Mayan culture, there was a perspective that was engaged, almost like a lens through which they saw reality. And there was a geometry to that, out
Very
of
good.
which came their architecture, but also perhaps their culture itself, which would mean mathematics and science and art and music and crafts and, the way they plant crops, for that matter.
Yeah.
Everything referring back, it's sort of like their basic frame of reference. And you're postulating that actually all cultures have some parallel to this, that there's a geometrical formula or structure out of which we sort of live. So we're in the United States, you could say, in Western Europe, we're a bit more angular. And there are other cultures that you could say, more indigenous cultures, which would tend to be more circular or spherical. Is this sort of the thread you were talking about?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, it's just totally in accordance with what I'm saying.
Good, I
So,
finally understand after all of these years.
well, if a very significant beginning of a new wave was the so-called long count that started at 3115 BCE. And that's the 13 Baktuns of the Baktun is a name of a Mayan time period.
Yes.
That came to an end in 2012, and that was what gave rise to all these kind of discussions that were at hand in those times.
Yes.
But so when I first
2012 or 2011?
It's really 2011. I was just
Okay.
adapting, trying to not
I
stir up any.
remember.
It's still the real one is 2011, but that's
What I want to let everybody know.
Maybe we can leave that behind.
All right, fine. I just want to let everyone know that we had a very interesting moment in 2011 where Carl, distinct from contradistinct, from every other Mayanist out there and popular culture who always embraced 2012 as the year of the change in the Mayan calendar, Carl, and he has good reasoning behind this, stated it was 2011. So we had a fun little hoopla about that at the time. But yes, we could leave that aside. But you deserve credit, if I may say, for having stood up to the entire world, Carl, who had any feeling for the subject and stood your ground. So as we say in Chinese, mazel tov.
Okay. Okay. But anyway, that long count, it started then 3115 BCE. And I remember when I first came to Mexico and to these pyramids in 1979, and I asked the tour guides at Chichen Itza, why did they choose this particular date? And they said, oh, it means nothing, it's mythology, they had a mythic thing. Okay.
They had a psychedelic experience is what they had.
Maybe so. But
we'll get to that.
But yeah, we'll get to that. But I already knew enough of history to know that the first real civilizations of our planet in Egypt, in Sumeria, and in the Indus Valley, they actually start around that time, 3100 BCE. So the question is really, how could it be? What was it in this calendar system that that made it coincide with its beginning, coincided with the first civilizations of our planet.
Mm-hmm.
And many years later, I think in 1992 or something like that, I read about what actually is inscribed in the inscriptions from the Maya. And they describe, they don't describe anything happening on Earth in 3115 BCE.
Mm-hmm.
Other chronologies are based on Muhammad or Jesus or Moses or living people on our planet. But the Maya didn't describe anything earthly. Instead, they describe something happening in what they called the place of creation, which is the center of the cosmos, as far as we can understand it. And what it says, to be more specific, is that in this place of creation, this was erected like a projection of an 8-partitioned star. Not a physical star, but you can imagine like a compass rose with 8 directions.
Mm-hmm.
That's what they said. In the sky, in the heavens, in the center of the universe, whoever was there, they talked about the first father and so forth, and whatever it is, they said that's what happened. And
so was this in what we would refer to as a multidimensional, or what we would hold as an invisible reality?
Well, I wouldn't call it invisible, but anyway, what we do know, and at the same time as this perpendicular compass rose-like structure was activated in the place of creation, we know that human beings for the first time start to create truly perpendicular architecture on our planet. In pyramids, in cities, and then at the same time, I would say then that people download this quantum state. It goes through, it's mediated to us through waves of creation. And then when we download this, our mind is changing. It gets structured according to this perpendicular geometry. Then we start to create outside of ourselves pyramids. Let's build a pyramid. Like a very interesting coincidence is that the Great Pyramid in Giza is actually 8-sided. So it fits exactly that kind of description that the Maya would say happened in the sky, in the cosmos, a geometry that comes. And then we can start to think, before this point in time, probably people were in a much more floating state sort of consciousness, that there's all these flood myths and so forth, but
yes.
it didn't have that kind of a structure. Their mind didn't have that kind of a structure that would allow them to build cities and to have writing. Writing means you have to know if a sign is there and how is it related in a line, so to speak, or a vertical or horizontal line. It's the place in a mental vertical horizontal structure that determines the meaning of writing, really. So writing comes out only after this point when the Mayas say that what happened was that they, in the place of creation, a new geometry was created, and humans start to download that, and then you have a civilization, as we call it.
Yes.
So we are a little bit like pawns in a game, I think.
Yeah.
Have you thought about, have you noticed?
Sadly, yes.
Yeah.
I'm reminded, Carl, of an interesting perception psychology experiment based on what you're telling me. where I think it was Jerome Bruno conducted a study, a test, where he had young little pussycats in a room just born, and all of the movement, the furniture, everything else that was there was vertical, like almost striped.
Yeah.
And another room where everything was horizontal.
Yeah.
And after a period of time, he put the little pussycats into the other room, and they were knocking into everything, and they could not get themselves straight.
Wow.
Because, so interesting, what was discovered in this study was that the eye brain was being imprinted by the environment to such an extent that it was only able to perceive what it had been presented with at this point from birth.
Yeah.
And that kind of programming / conditioning is so real. It's not a figment, it's not theoretical, it's actual. And this experiment helps to underscore what you're saying about the download of geometry, whether it's perpendicular or it's triangular or whether it's spherical, what have you. It's actually making a physiological change in our body and mind.
Absolutely.
Just wanted to offer that.
Oh, it's a great parallel. And I mean, we are really shaped by downloading these from birth, you might say, these geometries.
Yes.
That's my view. Yeah.
Exactly. That's right. So how then, I mean, you laid a really wonderful foundation here. By the way, I have to say, I'm also reminded of some of the work of wonderful cellular biologist Bruce Lipton, who is a dear friend and will be on the show again relatively soon, who speaks about our cells being influenced by their environment and adapting from the environment. And the environment to a cell, let's say in the stomach or the liver or the lung or wherever, is being influenced by the mind and shaped by the mind, which is external in some way to that cell. So therefore, the idea of our emotions, stress, and our belief systems are directly as environment to the cellular world, influencing the life of the cellular world. So you could say that we are, in this case, by this example, the cell, and the geometry, which is existing perhaps in the galactic center, the center of the universe, say, is whatever reason, downloadable and influencing us in ways that are invisible, that we don't see, but our culture manifests through our art, our architecture, and culture.
Yeah. In my understanding, there are 9 waves or 9 levels, 9 quantum states in this macrocosmic quantum theory that ultimately is based on the Mayan pyramids and their embryo of a new science, you might say. In that, the lower waves are all about creating the biological organism in the physical sense of the word. And then with the 5th wave comes, which started 100,000 years ago, then is added upon that the symbolic representations that human beings started to make about 100,000 years ago. But a very floating symbolic things, not the kind of sharp art that like the Egyptians would later do. And then on top of that comes a couple of other waves that are creating our reality up until our present time. But come back to what you're bringing up here, the cellular functions then and so forth. It is like these different 9 waves, they create an interference pattern. Whether they are part of the creation of the biological being or the mental spiritual being, the unification of the spiritual and the biological comes because these different waves create an interference pattern, and that I would call also an evolving quantum field, really, what that is about. And so because they're all, everything then is connected through these 9 different waves and the interference between them, then we can find that, yes, there is a connection between psychosomatic effects and all that kind of things, the effects of the environment on ourselves, etc., etc.
Yes.
But so there is a certain independence of each level, so to speak. The cellular is certain independence from, for instance, the more mental levels that come up, but they're also all connected and
interacting, right, and interconnected, right. You know, I'd like to make a point first that underlies everything you're saying in the book and here, before we launch more into, which I'd like to do, into the psychedelic aspect of this, which is there's this interesting idea that evolution is sort of linear and it goes in one direction. And one of the things that I feel you have helped to unearth with your deep study of Mayan cosmology is that it doesn't really all go that way. If the Mayans had a quantum theory, for instance, and that for Western culture only started way after the Newtonian revolution. In fact, even the Einsteinian revolution, i.e. with Niels Bohr in the early part of the 20th century. But if we go back, let's see, 2000 plus 3000, 5,000 to 6,000 years and see, oh my God, the Mayans have this. And we also know that native peoples of Turtle Island, of the United States of America, and elsewhere, Africa, South America, Siberia, also had their own form of science and physics and biology that in some ways are equal to, and we could say surpass, our current scientific understanding. It changes everything. It's like taking a deck of cards and throwing them up in the air and saying, no, it ain't the way you think, Bob. Western civilization and sort of, European/American science and technology are growing toward a certain consummation and acme. Wait a minute, we can go back to the Chinese and see that they had in developments, that technological developments with using water, creating things like electricity. Same with the Egyptians that had their own water-based battery, things of this sort. And we have to stop and take a look and say, it is not linear at all. It's a series of, I don't even know quite how to put it, except for the card metaphor, it's way different than we conceive. And possibly part of that perpendicularity is that we conceive only of this one, charted line, and it ain't necessarily so. It's actually not so at all. And your work has helped to really flesh that out. So I just wanted to make that point, and I'd love to hear your comments before we take a psychedelic journey.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. But I would say, especially when it comes to the big picture of the evolution of life, ancient peoples were much more, had a better picture. The overall picture was better than it is today. But I would
The
also say
holistic picture, if you will, the
that
systems
holistic,
understanding.
yeah, yes, the systems understanding, exactly. But we may be better at, measuring the all kinds of technological phenomena and all the detailed knowledge and these big data science that is coming out of modern science, all that kind of stuff. But it's almost now that they've come to a point where they just generating enormous amounts of data, but nobody really thinks about it or gets any coherent picture of our reality.
Yes.
And there is also another distinction that I'd like to make, is that modern science really looks upon, it doesn't describe life. It really doesn't see the universe as living. It looks upon it essentially as dead matter, and only dead matter can you study with these kind of measurements, techniques, and so forth. And I think that's when I talk about the waves, that's really an interesting example of how in ancient times, when people talked about these waves, they would talk about them as dragons, as plumed serpents, as the rainbow serpent, or the great anaconda that created the human beings in the Amazonas, and so forth. They looked upon these waves are living waves in a way. So, and it's from that connection, you create a holistic view of a living universe. And that's not what modern science does. Rather, it fragments reality and often just treats it as being dead phenomena. And that's an important difference.
That's a really important, good point. The word analysis from the ancient Greek actually means to break down. So into fine, discrete parts. And you, as a biologist doing cancer research back when, also were studying dead matter. And if you think about it, you're just inspiring me to this thought, which is that most of our modern medicine is predicated on the study of autopsies.
Yeah.
Dead people.
Right? Yeah, you may be right. Yeah.
that should tell us something.
You're right. I haven't thought about that. It's an interesting thought. Very interesting. Isn't that crazy? Right?
Yeah, it is.
So then,
but it just underscores your point about studying dead phenomena.
Right. Yeah, but you're adding
I just
something
never thought of it that far through, But
yeah, you're adding something significant to it. And so then you can see then that there is a conflict has been for maybe 20 or 30 years between holistic alternative medicine, which really is about studying the living beings.
That's right.
And as you're saying, the established allopathic medicine is based on study of dead.
That's right. That's a whole other subject matter.
Yes.
With which I am extremely familiar as someone who has studied ancient medicine and energy medicine. But we'll do that for another time. I would love to hear about the interface, Carl, of Mayan cosmology, quantum science, psychedelics, and the pineal gland in particular, which you could say is the internal conductor and metabolizer of a different kind of information, plant information, if you will, coming into the human system.
Yeah, okay. Well,
but frame it in whatever way you want. That was just my
okay, but we should go into the whole topic of psychedelics at this point.
That's correct.
Right.
That's the idea.
Right. Okay. So I think really that the Mayan calendar system, the Mayan science as a background, which really accounts for a multi-dimensional reality in a not in a far-fetched way. It immediately does that because each of the different quantum states that we download accounts for a certain way of perceiving reality, and they are distinct depending on what quantum state you're developing resonance with.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is all consistent then with the idea that if you take a psychedelic, you will go into another state. You will perceive reality differently. And how could that be? Well, my overall explanation is that in our normal default state of consciousness, which really isn't normal, but you can talk about it as default. Maybe it's abnormal, but it's default.
It's less normal these days than ever.
Yeah, that's right. It's less normal these days than ever. But anyway, that is very much, that is really very much still structured by that kind of perpendicular quantum state that we talked about earlier. Mm-hmm. That, you know, people, 5,000 years ago, people no longer were just sort of floating around and sensing the plants and stuff like that. They got a download of a very rigorous, very strict geometry of perpendicular orientation. And downloading that geometry compartmentalized our brains. So, for instance, that's what gave rise to the separation in left and the right brain half, and or if you will, the frontal and the parietal lobes. Mm-hmm. So there is a compartmentalization of the brain taking place as a result of people downloading this perpendicular quantum state. And so then, you know, there's been for quite some time, there's been a sort of more of a philosophical idea that maybe the brain or the mind is like a reducing valve, as they said, mm-hmm. that limits our perception to reality. And that is exactly what I believe too, except that, you know, throughout my books, there is a lot of evidence that this is actually the case, that the mind that we downloaded at this point of time is the reducing valve. It is what that limits our perception of reality.
Well, this, of course, as you and I both know, is largely the premise of Aldous Huxley's The Door of Perception.
Yeah.
And it's also a kind of a fundamental understanding of people who are in the world of, say, transpersonal psychology, understand exactly, as you're putting it, that there is the vast amount of information, if you will, or potential perceptions that can't possibly be cognized, metabolized, received. And so the mechanism of the brain in conjunction with the mind begins to narrow it. And so while ultimately what we see is just a thin representation of reality, which we of course call reality.
Yes, right. Our default state, so to speak. And
correct.
Yeah. So, but anyway, what I'm bringing to the party of this discussion, and I agree, there's been many that have been saying exactly what you've been saying, but is to understand exactly how the mind, a particular quantum state of the mind, a particular geometry of the mind is what has created this reducing valve.
Oh, yes. Oh, I see where you're going with this. Yeah. Okay. Okay.
So what that means is that my explanation to how psychedelics work is that they disconnect this particular quantum state. They disengage really the whole mind from the brain. And then as that happens, we become receptive to all possible 9 waves that has all kinds of information and other perception, spirits, and God knows what. And, you know, I should say, at least my experience with ayahuasca, coming to some kind of a floating state where everything floats around me, which is really what I think people, based on looking at ancient cave paintings and so forth, the horses they portrayed were upside down, and they were, you know, the ancients would talk about the life after this one as a floating on some rivers and that kind of a thing. So now, and then I discuss how exactly this connection could take place between mind and brain. But coming back to pineal gland.
But does this mean then, Carl, disengagement from that perpendicularity that was downloaded? So in a sense, it might become more circular or spherical, a different geometry altogether. So
yeah,
there would be admission and recognition of these different forms that we otherwise would not be able to see.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
So, but anyway, what's the role of the pineal gland in this? Well, what I emphasize then is that the pineal gland is at the center of our brains. And another thing that I'm, you know, talking about is that our connections to the center of the universe that emits these waves that we download, so to speak. It goes through the planet, our Earth, and then the next step is the heliosphere, the solar system, then it's the galaxy, and then finally the whole universe. And now still that kind of stepwise connection will require some kind of central points, like a center of the universe, center of the galaxy, center of the sun, center of the earth. And that brings me to this other interesting connection, I think, that if you look at the center of the earth, we now know that that's a big crystal. And that much of those crystals are hexagonal. And an interesting aspect of the pineal gland is that it's one of the few organs of our body that has crystals. And those crystals are hexagonal. So I think there is something to qualifying the pineal gland as an anchoring point for this mind that we download through this sequence, through the earth, and then ultimately to ourselves. So that's what I look upon. It's the anchoring point of that structured geometric mind. And what psychedelics do is that they interact not only with the pineal gland, but also with many other points in the brain where this this geometry is anchored, you might say, and then disengages it. It's through the interactions with the certain receptors in the brain. It disengages, and that allows us for some time, as long as that disengagement is at hand, that allows us to be receptive and see things totally different without that reducing valve that the geometry of the sixth wave provides.
That is beautiful. As one who has also experienced ayahuasca more than once, I can appreciate the point you're making of the expansiveness and going beyond. It has a transcendent quality of the three-dimensional reality with which we're also familiar. I'd like to remind people, though, when you talk about a default state, that we're actually shifting consciousness all the time, but
Good
aren't
point.
really noticing it. And in
Good.
fact, every day it's built in by nature and biology, one and the same, that we go to sleep. It
Hmm.
is part of our daily cycle. And when we go to sleep, we go from a beta state to an alpha state, to a theta state, to a delta state. And if we can remain conscious, going through those levels of slower brainwave activity, the mind becomes activated, interestingly, even by slowing down, to opening up to the kinds of realities that we could be experiencing through the plant medicine of ayahuasca, or for that matter, mescaline or peyote. Each one has its own characteristics and type and personality, just like human beings do. And
Yeah.
that's a fun thought in itself, that plants have personalities, and some are rich and some are poor and some are alive and some are a little quieter and sleepier, as with animals. And it's just all of a sudden, as you're saying, when you remove yourself from the perpendicularity, whether it's from the ingestion of an external substance or by activating what neuroscientist Joe Dispenza talks about, the inner pharmacy, we start to have these larger, varied, extraordinary perceptions. So I just wanted to bring that
Yeah.
idea that
I
it's
thi-
part of the human experience by definition, that we have altered mental states and emotional states, for that matter, i.e. all the time.
Yeah. Yeah. And it also um, it also comes back to, I mean, some of these levels, these different brainwave levels, correspond to meditative states and so forth.
Of course.
And what I think I'm concluding from my book is also then that people used to think that psychedelics or drugs are something completely different from say
Us.
breathing techniques or
Oh,
meditations or something like that.
yeah.
But what I'm saying here is that it all comes into a deeper understanding if you understand that they're all disengaging this structure of the mind, and in that way they allow us to have more open experiences. And so I'm not saying that meditation and psychedelics and breath work are identical, but I am saying that it's a variation of a theme. They're not completely different. It's just
Yes.
they bring you to somewhat different states and so forth. But the basic idea is that if you allow yourself to disengage this structural geometry, you will be more open to cosmic influences that are unifying and changing yourself in a more positive sense, a more loving sense, that rather than the sort of structuring and
Linear.
actually
Yeah.
linear judgmental aspects of that particular quantum state.
That's so well put. And I'm just realizing that the place where the monad, the idea of a single God, came from is in Western culture.
Yeah. Yeah.
And monotheism was not found in Asian cultures or African cultures or South
Yeah.
American
Yeah.
cultures. It got exported, yes, but what you find there are polytheism, theistic perspectives,
Yeah.
multiple deities, a deity of the rock and of the trees and the bush and the flowers and the sky. Everything was living, like you were saying before, earlier. And that does not align with a perpendicularity or an angularity of consciousness, but
Mm-hmm.
a structure does, of bottom from top down, which we have in every single aspect of our lives.
Yeah.
And right. And so having a monotheistic idea of God, an absolutist idea, just very naturally, you could say, evolves from that headset. Whereas, we were talking about the more circular or spherical, which is, by the way, is more equated with a feminine aspect, a yin aspect. Just look at a woman's body and look at
Mm-hmm.
a man's body. I mean, it's there biologically. And
Yeah.
in those cultures, you know, there is a much larger systems thinking and embracing of all life and all life forms, not just what aligns with. And you could even say I don't know where to go with this just yet, but the ownership, the whole idea of ownership of land and crops.
Mm-hmm.
Now,
Exactly.
I haven't
Yeah.
put that together, but you see
Yeah.
where I'm going with this.
Yeah.
Could you
That,
comment on that? I'd love to hear what you have to say.
well, I wrote about that in an earlier book, The Global Mind and the Rise of Civilization.
Yes.
And the whole idea that when you get a compartmentalized mind, you download a compartmentalized mind, it means that you start to compartmentalize also the nature. And you say,
Everything. Right.
oh, okay, so this square here is my property, and here I'm going to plant agriculture, wheat or whatever. And
Yes.
then you start to fence in your cows and stuff like that, which is another compartmentalization that you're projecting onto the world. So agriculture actually came out of this kind of projecting the geometry of the geometric structure that you had downloaded from the cosmos. That's where it started. And it seemed, since it comes from the cosmos, people must have thought, oh, good, God is behind us or something, or
Yes. Right.
the gods. But it's really an evolving thing. And so maybe at one point that was a step that we were meant to take, but now maybe we're meant to reverse those steps, actually.
Many years ago when I was a student in traditional Chinese acupuncture school, many moons ago, we had to write a paper. And I had been particularly interested in the psychology of Carl Jung and the idea of yin and yang, of course, and male and female, the masculine and the feminine, and the synergy between them, entelechy from Aristotle, that idea. So I was interested, never in needles, but I was interested in the effect of ancient Chinese Taoist thinking on the Western mind,
Mm-hmm.
and less interested, but recognizing the value of the influence of the Western mind on the ancient Chinese mind.
Mm-hmm.
And that, there's always going to be value in both.
Yeah.
And right. So I wrote a paper, Carl, called East Meets West, Who's Being Needled?
Yeah.
So anyway, the idea was that the more Chinese medicine was integrated into our Western medical systems, it was going to have a commensurate effect eventually on the mind of the practitioner, because it required a Taoist headset, which is the opposite of the angular perpendicular headset. I didn't put it that way, but I did the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere. I use that metaphor, if you will, but, and it's true. So there will be a softening, because you have to look at the client. You have to examine them. You have to look in their eyes. You have to look at their skin. You have to smell them. You have to take their pulse. You have to look at the tongue. You're personally engaged. And then when you go to treat, you know, you're looking at a whole system of meridians, of energy lines, of life force. You're not just looking at the operation, for instance, of the kidney, and something's broken with the kidney, like there's a valve in your car that has to be replaced. Now, that has its value, there's no question about it. But if you look at it systemically, you can have a lot more positive effect on the entire outcome of the car or of the human system.
Yeah.
Anyway, I just wanted to offer those thoughts in light of what you're saying here.
Yeah. 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 Clearly. Yeah. Western medicine is what they call organotropic. In other words, if you have some kidney failure, you try to heal the kidney, and which means, you know, it's a step in compartmentalization of the human body, whereas Eastern medicine is not compartmentalized in that sense, but systematic or system-based. And so if you have some problem with a kidney, you poke the toe or the ear.
Exactly. You're touching a point along the meridian, which is the energy path of the organ being the larger manifestation of the idea behind the function of the system.
Yeah.
If you want to think about it that way. And every single organ has a yin and yang component. So if you're working on the kidney, just to continue the metaphor, you might have to work on the urinary bladder, or there are any number of different ways of analyzing it. We're not going to go into that now, but you're always dealing with a system, and then the larger contracted manifestation, which is what we in the West, of course, would call an organ. And so would they. But it's led up to through an entire intelligence that is guided by spirits, which you could call as just another form of subtilized intelligence, leading up to the concrete form of the energy field, which is the organ.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, just to create a whole picture.
Sure.
You know, we're beginning to run out of linear time.
Linear time? Forget about linear time.
Forget it. Toss it out. But I would love to hear more of what you have to say about, I mean, I appreciate very much that the understanding that the Mayans had of the structures of mind that got created in different, let's say, geographical areas of the world, and how we've been reckoning with that. The limitation, you know, there's an expansiveness to it and there's a limitation to it, which you've been, and I've been fairly clear about here today. But I'd love to know more about what the Mayan understanding may have been and the Mayan use of psychedelics for their own further understanding.
Yeah, well, I guess what we do know, since we're talking here about the ancient Maya, there is a living Maya, of course, but my studies have been in the ancient Maya because they had a much more elaborate time science, you might say, than it's at hand today. But what we do know is that from this region of Central America, there are these hundreds or thousands of different mushroom men that have been dug up from different sites, and usually it's a mushroom coming out of the of a man or something like that. And what we also might say is that several of their the imagery on their reliefs, on their lentils and so forth, look kind of bizarre in the psychedelic sense of it. You see kind of monsters, you see baby jaguars, you see all kinds of strange things that do indicate that they may be the product of some kind of psychedelic visions. Um, and it's, you know, I recently saw a guy actually on Facebook who sort of questioned the traditional understanding of how the Mayan kings in ancient times would enter their trance, and he would point out that you know, maybe they actually, some of these pictures actually depict psychedelic substances and so forth. But one thing that I think should connect things a little bit here is the fact that in these portrayals that they used to make, they would typically have serpents, and serpents there would come out an ancestor through the head of the serpent, and that ancestor would be talking to some Mayan king or queen or something like that, and giving information as to what they would do. And then if we connect that to not only the waves that I've been talking about here, but also the fact that the most common experience that people have who are using ayahuasca are serpents. Then we are bringing, you know, together a mixture of phenomena that could indicate that yeah, they also, the kings, when they were given their prophetic understanding of the future and so forth, that they could have been influenced by psychedelic substances. But we know for a fact that there's a tremendous amount of mushroom men among the artifacts from this area. So there's no reason to doubt that that's what they were using.
Is there any textual reference in the Mayan journals and logs that have been extant?
I have not heard of that. It's a good question, and maybe I should start studying it.
Yeah.
And we may not know exactly how they would call. They probably wouldn't talk about psychedelics. They what would they call this kind of experience? Certainly, they have all these spirits and all these what we today call altered states of consciousness, but I've never read that they described in text any of these kind of uses. It could be, I don't know.
But you are making the supposition based on your deep knowledge of Mayan cosmology that it makes organic sense for them to have been utilizing various plant medicines as part of their cultural activity and heritage.
Yeah, I would say so. And of course, that's true for many indigenous peoples in the Americas.
By all means.
Whether you're in the Southwest or if you're in the Amazonas or...
It would be surprising from that point of view that they would not have. Exactly. They would have been the exception in that case, which there's no reason to think that whatsoever. Right. Not to mention, I mean, their creativity and their insight into time, as you called it so interestingly, time science, and the many calendars they had. Most people, of course, think it's only one, but you've taught me that there are many agricultural, ceremonial, etc. That they were indeed using plant medicines. The only thing that doesn't add up in that regard to me, based on my lack of knowledge, and maybe you could say a word about this, is what we understand to have been human sacrifice that was taking place there. And one of the experiences that we Westerners have, and you alluded to, when we use plant medicine, is the moving away of the perpendicularity and the access to the prefrontal cortex and the heart as a brain, if you will, and the compassion and love that is inside the opening up of these energy centers, which makes us more human, if you will, and therefore really more evolved. So in light of all of that, the idea of human sacrifice, which I know we're looking at through our own cultural lens, but on the terms of even the Maya themselves, do you have anything to share with us about what that might have meant for them?
Well, what we what we do know is a little bit of the Aztec view, because Spanish chronicles actually directly told what the Aztec looked upon them, and the Aztecs were sacrificing people on a very large scale, as far as we understand, and it's no secret because you actually have it in the ancient Aztec codices before the Europeans came, and they seems to have done it in order to simply to appease the gods, and I think that's probably what the Maya did as well. So there is evidence of human sacrifices also from the Maya. I tend to think that it's become exaggerated, though. You know, a lot of people, that's what they think is all. Mayan culture was all about human sacrifices, so to speak, and it doesn't seem like it took that enormous scale that it actually did take among the Aztecs. So they fought wars between these different cities in order to capture a bunch of prisoners that they could sacrifice, and we know that. And but at the same time, you know, the Vikings had human sacrifice. You can read about in the Bible human sacrifices, and at one point in time, I think a lot of different cultures practiced it. And I would also say here that this sixth wave quantum state that was activated 5,000 years ago, it created a duality of the human mind. And that duality, I think, really also gave rise to a tremendous amount of brutality, cruelty, and so forth, that we, you know, that until the mid-1700s, nobody protested against slavery really in the world. Only at that quantum shift, I would say, did people start to perceive reality differently and started to think, hey, we cannot treat human beings like this. But this is so before that point in time, people were tremendously cruel. I mean, torture was sort of, it was normal. It wasn't thought about as wrong or anything like that. And I think we should have that background. Human sacrifice, yes, I think they did, and but I don't think they did on an enormous scale. And the Maya, as everybody else, I don't have any view of them as being angels. I think they were very much shaped by that kind of duality of the mind of, you know, the rulers and the ruled, that everyone else were in those days. And so that's the reason they didn't escape being exercising their own forms of cruelty and so forth. So I have no idea, you know, I don't have the view that they were angels or models for us for our time, but I just want to highlight that it doesn't change the fact that they developed a kind of a quantum time science that is very valuable.
Oh God, yeah. So you could say, let's look at any particular culture and glean from it their greatest contribution to the larger planetary cycle. You know, and in terms of this whole subject of sacrifice, Carl, I mean, I don't think we have to look very far. We can look at today's society and see human sacrifice. And it comes perhaps a little more subtler, I mean, you know, but it's there. If you think about different medicines, drugs, that are developed, and human beings are essentially the guinea pigs. And
Yeah.
that's happening today regarding this whole issue with COVID. They have
Yeah.
said, they have asked for, government has asked for people who are willing to experiment with drugs that have never been used before on
Mm-hmm.
animals, on mice. They don't know what effect these are going to have, but
Right.
they're supposing. But even short of that, just the use of dyes and genetically modified foods, organisms, and glyphosate, and you name it, is in our food supply, in our air, in our water. We're being sacrificed for the god of money all the time, you know, so
Yeah.
let's not
Yeah.
kid ourselves, you know.
Right.
The
Right.
21st century is not so, you know, advanced. You
Right.
know?
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Anyway, just to
Yeah.
contextualize the
I agree.
conversation, you know.
Good point.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. But just, you know, we do have a few more minutes. I just want to take a few more, and I'd just like to go back to something you said about the hexagonal crystalline shape of the pineal gland, the contents of the pineal
Mm-hmm.
gland, and of the, what was the other item?
The center of the earth, the
Oh,
inner
I'm sorry,
core,
this
which is
crystalline
a
core.
crystal. It has a
So,
crystal structure.
yes, so it's not molten lava, but it's a
No,
crystal. And so,
exactly.
do you think that there is therefore this interesting resonance then
Mm-hmm.
between these two,
Yeah.
that help to, I mean, I want to say that, you know, the body is basically electrical, and that's an interesting phenomenon in light of all of this. It
Mm-hmm.
operates according to a frequency, or many actually, you
Yeah.
know, so there is a harmonic resonance, if you will, between the crystalline structure inside the depth of the earth and ourselves.
Yeah. Right. So I
And
believe that.
I'd love for you to expand on that. And also, I want to add one other thing. Are you aware of that same structure in any kind of galactic place as well? So we have sort of a heaven, earth, and man in the middle.
Yeah. Yes. So yes, I think, and I spend a lot of time in my books to describe that there is a resonance between the two hemispheres of the brain and the eastern and western hemispheres of our planet.
Mm-hmm.
So the western hemisphere is in a special resonance with the left brain half. The eastern hemisphere is in a special resonance with the right brain half. And there is a line then that, and it actually exists in the inner core of the earth. There is a line essentially going through Berlin, Rome, down to Cape Town that separates the two hemispheres of our planet.
Oh,
And
interesting.
so there is solid basis for that. And there are very interesting consequences of that for this coronavirus, I can tell you, but it's there. Now, then you're asking a very good question. Is there a correspondence to the galactic structure? And I would say yes. I don't want to detail it, but it looks like there is a kind of resonance between this the plane that separates the two hemispheres on our brains or the planet, and the plane, the equatorial plane of the galaxy.
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of a vague reference, and I won't go that technical here, but I want to add one thing more, which is interesting, that, you know, the whole idea that I'm presenting is that the center of the universe emits these quantum states, spread them all over, and we may create resonance with them. We download them. And there is a people in Colombia, the Desana people, that were studied in the 60s by an anthropologist by the name of Gerardo Dolmatov. And he found that these people, and this is before, you know, there was a tourist industry of ayahuasca in Peru. This is the way they had it originally, so to speak.
Yeah.
And they said that, you know, that the way they described their different states of influence under the ayahuasca is that first they go to the Milky Way, to our galaxy, and then they even go beyond the galaxy to something they call the cosmic womb. And I believe that what they call the cosmic womb is what the Maya talked about as the place of creation. Some place there that emanates these waves across the universe to create its evolution.
So interesting. So we all have a resonance with it. And if you abide by the idea of fractal reality, then whatever is out there is also in here. And, you know, it's the old idea of the doctrine of signatures, this idea that, you know, we are everything. We are truly a microcosm of the universe. Yeah. And if that's the case, even though the Maya might be referring to something way out beyond the Milky Way, there is some replication of it right here in this bizarre human body, if you will, human being.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
It's interesting.
I know what you mean. Yeah.
So last question, that is, could you talk about this incredibly interesting subject we've been embarking on here and you have dedicated your life to? What would you say are the ramifications and the implications and the relevance, direct relevance? You just made reference just to the line, vertical line about, you know, Berlin and Cape Town to the coronavirus. What other direct relevance would you say the study of Mayan culture, cosmology has, and psychedelics for that matter, and the, you know, the titillating of the pineal gland to our daily life here on planet Earth at this time?
Yeah, at this time, you know, it really, I would say it provides the best explanation there is in terms of how the universe evolves and how we, as part of this whole universe, evolve as well. And so what relevance it has, I mean, certainly it provides a framework for understanding a tremendous amount of phenomena. We haven't had time here to go into those in detail and so forth. But one of the things that it does explain is how the psychedelics work and how you can connect the chemical level, the pharmacological level, the cerebral level, and connect that with the cosmic level. So it changes the whole medical concept of the effects of psychedelics and why there's so much research that is now coming out to say that it is healing. Now that's one thing, and there's so many things that I believe this is a coherent theory that is the best to understand how the universe evolves through quantum leaps. As part of that, you know, when it comes to becoming a little bit more practical, I'd like to advertise that event that I will be having on 6th of June together with Patricia Albert. And we're teaming up for this particular event. And it's called Accessing the Ninth Wave as through Shared Unity. That's what we talk about. That's the overall title of it. And so I just talked here essentially about the sixth wave and the brutality and all that kind of thing that came out of that particular wave. Now, it seems, if you follow these different quantum states, that the purpose of humankind is actually to go up to the 9th level. And that's a level that doesn't have geometry, it doesn't have duality, it's sort of the possibility of a reunification. And what our particular event will be is to try to demonstrate practical tools, or give people for this free event practical tools in order to take the quantum step up to that 9th level. And that's a fundamental change in how we look upon our spiritual or religious paths. It's no longer about it's no longer about the individual path. It's about going from me-ness to we-ness. Yeah. So as all these quantum states, and this one was activated only in 2011, and it's only beginning to become more accessible to people. But all of them are quantum states, meaning that you don't get there just by doing more of the same. You don't just do more of your individual path of yoga or anything else that might have been beneficial to you. But the point here is that the highest state is about going up to we-ness. You know, the kingdom of heaven is not inside you, it's between us. Mm-hmm. And
nice.
And that's what we will give tastes of practical exercises, you might say, or experiences for people to encourage them to take that last quantum step. And since that's the highest level of the pyramid, I at least conclude that that's where we need to go. And if we access a quantum state that doesn't have duality, doesn't have that kind of reducing valve geometry that sets us off, if we do that, it means we no longer will seek to dominate nature or dominate other people. It's inherent an existential equality between people in having access to that state of consciousness. And so that's what I'm pointing to here, is that this is here the theory that I've been talking about with you and you've been talking about with me. It actually leads into something, what to do and how to do it. And that's part of what I think why it's important, except for all the interesting theoretical discussions that you and I could spend weeks and months engaging in.
Really true. Well, that's great, Carl. We will put up the information for people to access that free event coming up on the 6th of June, which is very soon. We're being beckoned to conclude. I want to just thank you so much for your lifetime of work and dedication to the subject of mind cosmology and bringing it step by step into the world for us all to digest and reflect on and benefit from. And it's a pleasure to see you again and have you back on A Better World. And we will do so again.
Thanks, Mitch. Thanks for your great contribution to our discussion here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Wow, I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did.
That's fun.
It was so rich. This is Mitchell J. Rabin for A Better World. Thank you so much for joining us, and I look forward to seeing you all next week. Remember to contact me at mjr@abetterworld.net. Share your thoughts, your comments, feelings about the shows. I look forward to seeing you all